what I understand the brother is saying is if black ministers just understood it from this perspective and preached this from the pulpit here in the African American community, apparently that would, change our state of mind and our state of being. And I had a question about the bloodlines from our royal kings and queens. How come we aren't able to this day to trace our bloodlines back to those ancient kings and queens coming out of Kemet? How did that, get cut off? And how can we rediscover that? And those are my questions. Thank you.
Okay, in reference to how do we rediscover that, well, the communiversity that we're having right now, that's what we're doing, we're rediscovering it. You don't have to really deal with a bloodline, just look in the mirror, okay? You don't look like we come from Europe, okay? Every feature that African people have, the black people that I look at in America, my travels throughout the African continent, look like somebody on the African continent. In reference to the whole slave thing you're talking about, I think we should give respect to, peace be upon him, who's now an ancestor, Tony Martin. And Tony Martin, who wrote The Jewish Onslaught. I think that's a very powerful book to get, okay, to read his book in terms of, the Jewish involvement in enslavement, and also the Nation of Islam, who equally wrote a book, slip of my mind, the title of the book on the Jewish slave trade. But Secret Relationship Between Blacks and Jews, that's the title, A Secret Relationship Between Blacks and Jews that Nation of Islam put out. Those two books would give you an in-depth information in terms of their involvement and what took place during that time. As I said, there are some preachers, not all preachers, but some preachers who deal with a black theology. Many are still into a white theology, a white supremacy Christianity and the teaching of white idolaters, okay, idolatry, okay, or the worship of white images and white divinity, and not seeing our own black divinity. Even the whole spiritual enslavement and the negativity from the time that we were children, and we see things as angel's food cake versus a devil's food cake. That representation in the psyche growing up as a child, okay, will see a negativity when it comes to their own black divinity. When something is taught to them at an early age of something negative about black, even when they had around the country of a black child would have represented as a devil next to a little white child as an angel. See, that is called spiritual warfare. Okay, to make sure that white idolatry will stay in this place for the spiritual enslavement of African people. This is something that we have to understand, that this spiritual warfare that is still going on, knowing that as I say it again, the corruption of the many spiritual black divinities and stories that were taken off of these temples and tombs, okay, knowing that they stole these things in the first place. So, again, African people, okay, we are an ancient people. We have to go back to the original stories. If nothing else, start to do a comparative analysis. And just like someone stealing something, you can see that these stories were taken from the Nile Valley. If they're so pagan and heathen, why are they the same exact stories? Okay, we talked about the whole, even the churches, the steeple of the church, okay, a symbol of the resurrection. You see the Tekenu, okay, there's Washington. And let's look at the architecture in Washington, D.C. It represents George Washington. That was stolen from Kemet. It symbolizes the resurrection. By the way, of a SARS phallics. It was not about phallic worship. The Greeks didn't understand it, okay? But it was a symbol to show his resurrection, okay? Because it's a natural thing that right before sunrise, there's a resurrection. So that's the steeple of the church. That's what it is. The Greeks took it literally. They didn't understand the spiritual symbolism behind it. And then the Vatican, you got the Tekenu right down in the Vatican where Augustus Caesar took it from Kemet and brought it to Rome. And every Easter Sunday, every pope and even a new pope will stand in front of that window and look out to the thousands of people who are around that Tekenu that was taken, from Kemet, that symbolizes the resurrection. So even the architecture we can see. Again, that leads us right on into the whole Greek Orpheus thing of Easter that we see this getting ready to carry on right now. We give our children the Easter egg bunny, okay, and the Easter egg basket and all these things. And what if your child asks, Mom, Dad, does a rabbit lay eggs? Okay, no, a rabbit doesn't lay eggs. But why do we have this? Because of Greek Orpheus, when the European Greeks, a female would take off all her clothes, paint themselves, and run and hide. And the Greek males would take a pregnant rabbit. Why a pregnant rabbit? Because it represents proliferation and sex. And they would go hunt for the female Greek. And they would have indiscriminate sex and orgies and so forth. And this is how they thought the spring solstice came that we're in right now, and how nature came back, and they would have sex until the rabbit would have its litter. And why also a rabbit? Because he's born with his eyes wide open. That goes back in the first part of the show when I was talking about the whole lunar, the full moon during the time of the resurrection. Also, why a chocolate rabbit? Because a chocolate rabbit, okay, represents sex as well. Because when a person is not getting enough sex, they eat chocolate. Okay, so the Playboy bunny and the Easter bunny are the one and the same bunny. The symbolism, if nothing else, research the symbolism behind these holidays. Okay, just like when the last time I was on here, I was dealing with Christmas and the Saturnalia thing, and that they call Santa, well, okay, which is nothing but Satan. That's a whole other story within itself. But the symbolisms can tell you the stories, okay, and how these things came to be.
Well, tell us about you mentioned the Easter egg. What about the fact about Christ dying on the cross and Resurrection Sunday, as they call it, this Sunday, that he rose after 3 days? How did that story come about?
Well, one of the things that I show, sometimes talking about these things, if one doesn't have a visual documentation on the whole thing of the astrotheology around solar and lunar and stellar events, then it may go right over some of our heads, but it all represents the sun going through crossing the equator. That's what it represents right now. Now, when you see the cross, and many have seen the cross, and you always see a circle in the middle of the cross, okay? Why is that circle in the middle of the cross? Because that represents resurrection. The cross is an ancient African Kemetic symbol that's been corrupted, okay, by the Romans and by the Greeks. When Constantine, as we are told, saw the image of the cross, and he says, and the sign that he's carrying, and he's on a horse, Secvencius, and this symbol we shall conquer. And this is how the cross has come to the Western world. Again, a corruption from the ancient spiritual symbol that was called Amsu. Amsu symbolized a spiritual resurrection that the Romans didn't understand. As I talked about earlier, through the mummification of the body, they always used the cross to symbolize a spiritual resurrection. But the Romans didn't understand spiritual things, and the Western world still today don't understand spiritual things. They took it literally as a physical body, a corpse, okay? So here we see death, blood, and all this. When we see the image of the European Serapis Jesus cut on the side, when they unwrap the mummies, all the mummies have a cut on the side. This is where they took the organs out. Okay, so again, all the representations, I show this extensively in my presentation and documentation to show, as I'm showing without question, I don't come to these lectures, Brother Carl, for people to believe, but just to think that we are an ancient people, okay? These stories were taken from but corrupted, and we have not known it. And the sad thing that through this spiritual warfare and through the movies and so forth, they got a new picture out there called the Son of God, and what picture they slap up there? Every year they give you these pictures, okay? They have a new picture, or every other year, every 10 years, they have a new picture. The last one was the Passion of the Christ. And here, black folks said they almost died in the church, of how they whipped my Jesus. Okay, well, what image and representation were they showing? Okay, so here's a white guy being whipped, okay, and he said, this is my Jesus, almost died in the church. But when a brother made the picture, okay, the color of the cross, and showed a black Yeshua, okay, and called him Yeshua because that's a Hebrew name, okay, Jesus is Greek, by the way, okay, and it showed him as a political revolutionary fighting the Romans. And many Negro preachers told their congregation, don't go see that movie, The Color of the Cross. Go see The Passion of the Christ that Mel Gibson made. And this is, again, the indoctrination deep into the psyche. It's already played out. And all you got to do is put that image here. Now they got a new one called the Son of God, indoctrinating for the spiritual enslavement of African people today. As I said, the Son of God represented the Sa-Ra. Or, okay,
hang on a second, Brother Kwesi, because we're going to take another quick break. I'll let you finish up on that and the resurrection story as well. 800-450-7876 to speak to Brother Kwesi. I'll take your calls in about 2.5 minutes. And thank you for staying with us and our master teacher, Ashra Kwesi. And before the show's over, I'll tell you how you can reach him and get some of his products. Before the break, though, we'll be discussing what happened this weekend, or what's going to reenactment, if you will. Jesus dying on the cross and then rising on the third day. How did that story all come about, Brother Kwesi?
Well, they were created at the ecumenical conferences, okay? Again, as I said, they were corruption from the spiritual stories of the Nile Valley. Unfortunately, we, as I said over and over again, that we have not known the stories of the Nile Valley. What we got is a corruption, of the stories when we get it from a whole white supremacy Christianity's point of view and their whole white angelical realm, okay, interpretation of it, okay. So the whole cross, when we understand the spiritual idea of the cross, is called the Amsu. It represents, again, the spiritual resurrection. When I talked about the Gnostics, okay, now Yeshua would be a Hebrew term, okay, so now people say, well, you saying it wasn't a Jesus? No, there was no representation of this Jesus that we got in the European or Western world or white supremacy Christianity point of view. When we look at the black Gnostic Christ, held that every man and woman had a divine spark through their own spiritual development, and they taught that you could reach your own caress that I started at the beginning of the program, okay, or reach their own cause that the Gnostics called caress. That's why the Romans persecuted the early North African Christians called the Gnostics, who were the knowers of the truth. The world did not even know about the early writings of the Gnostics until they able to research in Nag Hammadi, where they found some Nag Hammadi scrolls there of the early Gnostic teachings, okay? So that tells us that they were trying to keep alive the original spiritual story. They were like the conduit, so to say, from the ancient spiritual mystery system, okay, that Paul calls the mystery religion, which in Paul and Corinthians, the idea of the Christ, and we see his writings, were taken from the spiritual mystery system of the Nile Valley. This is what we've got to look at. After all, as I continue to say, that they continue to research in the Nile Valley, okay, that means Biblical Archaeology Society and all these European white supremacists, Egyptologists, and so forth, but corrupting the story and above all trying to turn it away from African people. So let's go back to the early story. Let's go back to what the Christ really represented, which was based off of a spiritual development through that divine spark that we all have. It had nothing to do with this worshiping of this white image that was created. After all, if we should have an image up there, at least it should represent our people. At least should have a black divinity to it. Okay, so we can start to see our own spirituality in it and see our own deity in it, okay, for us to go into the future.
800-450-7876. Greg's been holding for a while. He's on line 3 from Maryland. Greg, you're on with Ashra Kwesi.
Hey, how's everybody doing?
Everybody's doing fine, brother. How you doing?
Hanging in there, brother. Couple of
Don't
questions,
hang now.
man. Couple of
We've
questions.
been hanging for a long time.
Yes, sir. Yes. Well, it's a fascinating topic. Question now. When I hear brothers basically attack Christianity, and and I guess
We're talking about white supremacy Christianity.
right, but I would separate the two.
Christianity of the Nile Valley.
I would separate the two, though. I think that Orthodox Christianity and white supremacy are two distinctly different things.
Well, if you got the images
and white supremacy,
Europeans, if you got the images and representations of Europeans, which you do in most churches, okay, and most representations of what we've been taught, that is a corruption.
That came from Catholicism, and Catholicism is like a hybrid of basically people who had pagan practices attempting to co-opt
That's
Christianity, and that's where
word
you got
incorporated into to neutralize African spirituality by calling it pagan. Okay,
No.
pagan.
Okay.
Pretty much really Easter Bunny, get rid of the Santa Claus and all the images and jingle bells and everything else. And that's what
Christianity predates white supremacy.
Okay, tell me what Christianity is. Tell me what Christianity this is. You're speaking. Are you speaking of the Gnostics?
I'm speaking about when you mentioned Paul in Acts, the 21st chapter. Paul
No. Christianity. I know. Don't start from the Christianity. Give me a time period of the Christianity. Are you speaking of the Gnostics?
I gotta speak the way I speak. You speak the way you speak. I speak the way I speak. Now,
I speak of historical. History. You're not giving me any historical facts to what you're saying here.
We have a dialogue. We're not fighting.
Greg. Put it in a question so he can respond.
He won't allow me. He's taking over the conversation.
Well, put in the question.
So the question I'm trying to ask is, okay, when people who oppose Christianity, why is it that always it invariably becomes pro the practice of magic or the mystery systems or the occult? So in other words, you're not Christianity, but then in its place, it's always play up the occult or mystery systems, which we know that's the primary question. We know that the Masonic thing is an absolute fact. It's proven in their literature that they say that they worship Lucifer. That's a fact, undeniable. So then why, and these are the people who practice the mysteries. These are the people who have instituted a satanic world government or world system that we're dealing with now, that we're fighting against now. So the first question is why brothers who not Christianity invariably play up the occult.
All right, let's give him a chance to.
Okay, well, first of all, when I speak of the mystery system, I'm speaking with the Greeks corrupted, okay, which they call the mysterion. What was called a mystery to them when they came into Kemet and they saw surgery, they saw physicians, they saw doctors, they saw everything that you know in the Western world, it became a mystery. The spiritual stories that were told, it was a mystery to them. That's how the mystery became, okay? It was called the Neter Makaru, the divine truth, okay? That's what was taught. That was in the Medu Neter. So when you're speaking of Christianity, you're coming in defense because that's what you've been taught to believe. And I'm saying is that the spiritual ideas that make up the Western version of Christianity were based off of the spiritual stories of the Nile Valley. That's why I said, what part of Christianity are you talking about? If you said the Gnostics, okay, because the Gnostics were trying to preserve what the Romans were corrupted. When you say Catholicism, okay, let's deal with the chronology of it, okay, because where did Catholicism come from? It came from out of the corruption from the Gnostics. When the Byzantine Roman Christians, that was the beginning of Christianity with Theodosius and Justinian. Theodosius is the one that sanctioned Catholicism. Protestant religion did not exist. Methodist did not exist yet, okay? So when you start with Christianity, you've got to start with, or the Western version of it, you've got to start with the Byzantine Romans. This is a historical fact. Now, some of the things that I'm talking about, I know everybody doesn't understand what I'm talking about when I'm talking about the ancient spiritual stories of the Nile Valley. But again, you're using the same corrupt terms to neutralize ancient spiritual stories that black people created by calling it pagan and heathen. As I said in the beginning of the program, that's what they created in the whole Da Vinci Code by calling it that. Now, we're not talking about the Masonic order, but the Masonic order is also corrupted from the spiritual system. When these Europeans who take and write this, who fear the Masons, because the Masons, in their own secret order, were taken from the early Gnostics, were taken from ancient Egypt, and was actually bypassing what the church, okay, did not want people to know, and that was ancient Egypt. Why don't they want people to know about ancient Egypt? Because they stole everything from ancient Egypt. That's why they don't want people to know, just like they stole you, okay? So the fear is that one day, people will open their minds up. The church did everything. They burned people at the stake for talking about ancient Egypt. If I was during the time of the Inquisition, they would be at my door, the Inquisitioners, to get me to burn me at the stake. Just like they were about to do with many of the, like Giordano Bruno. Okay, when he was starting to talk about ancient Egypt, they burned him at the stake. And many of the other Copernicus and many others and Kepler. And why did they shut down this? Science and knowledge. That's how Europe went through the so-called Dark Ages, because they shut down the spiritual stories of the Nile Valley. And that's the reason why they fear, okay, that coming into the educational system of the day, because the church neutralized. They thought the world was flat. They didn't want nobody to talk about the world was round. The Imhotep already talked about. Galileo, they're about to ready to burn him at the stake. And he had to recant, because the church had a lockdown. And the fear was that ancient Egypt had the secret. It had the secret for what they stole from the Nile Valley. But when we're talking to people who are ignorant of the chronology of time and history, it's hard to convey this. It's like coming into an elementary school trying to talk about, in some cases, the history of physics when one hasn't got to that stage yet. And all I'm saying is, don't believe what I'm saying. Have a critical analytical analysis to think and go do research, as I've said. If you're going to go buy the book, then go buy it. Okay, go to Proverbs. The fool believeth every word, but the prudent man looketh well to his going. So we need to stop being fools and open up our minds so we can think. Because they have used religion just like they've used everything else for conquest and enslavement of the people, physically and mentally and spiritually.
All right, hang on,
As I said, everybody else has benefited from it, from what they've taken out of ancient Egypt. Okay, our children go to school and they got to learn about Copernicus, they got to learn about Kepler, they got to learn about all these Europeans who slapped their names on the spiritual science that this man talked about, the mysteries and the occult. But there are various sciences, and everything that you do, from the computers and everything that you do today, is based off of that science. So get rid of your computers. Get rid of all the science. When you go to school, you've got to take science in school.
Right.
You can't go to university and just take Christianity.
Ashra Kwesi is our guest. 800-450-7876 to speak to him. We'll take your calls in about 2.5 minutes. And thank you for staying with us and the master teacher, Ashra Kwesi. Some of the folks who will be joining us in the next few days, Brother Keaty, Dr. Francis Cress Wilson, Craig Hewlett, Ramona Africa, and some other folks as well. And Neely Fuller is going to be here as well. Right now, the number to call, speak to Brother Kwesi, 800-450-7876. Brother Kwesi, you finished the response, or do you want to take another call?
It's sad, we start like the whole Christianity, Western version of it. Maybe we should start looking at some of the science shows. They got a brother on there dealing with the cosmos, okay, Neil deGrasse Tyson, okay. This is ancient science, okay, that came from ancient Egypt, Brother Carl. That much of what we know that was tried to shut down by the Western Church, okay? And even what he's talking about, if we were living during that time, they would burn Neil deGrasse Tyson. This is where you get the whole idea in the church today. If you don't believe, you'll be burned by the devil forever and ever. They just put it in the mind and the fear of a terrorized devil will burn you forever and ever, and Luther will get you, okay, to shut down and control the mind of the people. This is what we've got to look at, okay? So when we understand how this knowledge has come up from the Nile Valley, how it's been the best kept secret, and the fear of telling the story, because it's coming from black people, it's coming from African people, but we only know it from the European point of view that's been corrupted. This is what we've got to start to look at. And Neil deGrasse Tyson, I hope to see him start to deal with Imhotep and Kajimi and Ankh-Benor thousands of years before some of the people that he's talking about, like Newton, okay, and Galileo and some of the other people he's been talking about on his show. I hope he would get to some of the ancient African scholars of the Nile Valley, all right? But again, if you go to a university, you've got to take science courses, okay? You're not going to come up in there with no Christianity and say, this is my belief and this is that. You're going to get an F in that class. This is a community radio show. And through that, we've got to think outside of all the religions.
That's true. It's Emancipation Day it is today, so folks, emancipate your mind. 800-450-7876. Go to Simona. Simona's in Virginia. Been home for a while on line 4. Simona?
Yes. Hello, Dr. Kwesi, and thank you, Mr. Nelson, for taking my call. Dr. Kwesi, I so much appreciate your honesty and your passion for actually just emancipating our minds, helping us emancipate. And so in my process of emancipating my mind and bringing consciousness to my soul, I have 3 questions for you. In my ignorance, I just want to get a general answer. Where did the actual invaders, such as the Greeks, the Assyrians, the Romans, who obviously wanted to destroy and conceal the mysteries and the actual sciences and the where did they come from? Where did these invaders come from? Like, we all know that even I have Chinese blood in my family. My great-great-grandfather was Chinese, but he looked black. I have pictures. We have pictures. And he was black. And so I want to know, where did these invaders come from? And it's obvious what they wanted to do, but where did they come from? Why are they white? And number 2, why do preachers teach us this doctrine? It's obvious that, in today's time it's a money thing, but for the Christian, the Anglo-Saxon Christian belief that's being taught to us right now, have you ever thought of having like a standoff or something nationwide, or have you ever made an attempt to do that? And do you think it's too late to have a movement to confront the church? And then I just want to basically know when your next trip is to Kemet. I certainly that is my next goal. I've been all around the world, including the South Pole, but I've never been to Africa, the continent of Africa, and that's where I want to go. Yes, sir.
All right. Thank you, Simona. Thanks for your call. Brother Kwesi?
Yes, that's quite a bit there. Again, let me see. She was asking a question in reference to, okay, why is this not being taught? Okay, keep in mind that, Brother Carl, as we said before, where were the preachers made at? Let's keep it a historical fact with this. They were made on the plantation. Okay. This is where we see the early black preachers started at. Now, yes, there were liberating preachers like Nat Turner, Gabriel Prosser, okay, and many others, okay, who were teaching a black theology and understood the importance of a black theology and a black divinity and understood that white supremacy Christianity and whole white teaching of a white divinity was equally part of that enslavement. One was spiritual, it was equally just as bad as physical. So this is where you had the liberating preachers who used the Bible for liberation. And if we're going to deal with it, if we're going to deal with the whole Christianity, it should be, and found, or any of the religions, it should be from a black theology or a black divinity. Or it'll just keep us in worshiping either something out of Asia or something out of Europe or somewhere else. This is important. Now, as she mentioned, we do our annual educational tours annually every summer. Okay, for brothers and sisters, 34 years of my life, to go back to the temples. After all, from the biblical account, everybody's coming into Egypt, Brother Carl. Even though in many cases we don't have historical fact to some of these patriarchs and personalities, but we see Abraham is coming into Egypt. We see Moses grows up in Egypt. Even the story of Jesus fleeing Herod, he comes into Egypt. The Greeks who said they had to cross the burning sands, okay, that is the Sahara, to get to the northeastern corner of Africa. The Masonic order talking about the light of the world, the northeast corner of Africa. So let's go back. Let's go back and look at what they have been plundering and taking from these temples, okay, for over 2,000 years now. Let's do a comparative analysis. I always say, I don't come on these shows for people to believe in what I'm saying, but to think. There's an organ up there called the brain. And that brain is there for us to think, not to believe. You can believe in a whole lot of things. In fact, go to the Webster's Dictionary, and let's look at the etymology of the roots of words. And right above the word belief, there's a word called belie, B-E-L-I-E. And it means to disrupt, okay, and to distort. So what we got is a disruption and a distortion, okay, of ancient African stories. Has been demonized through paganism and heathenism and negative connotations, okay, to neutralize your mind from thinking and having a critical analytical analysis. And this is what this should be about. Like Malcolm said, take your religion and stick it in your back pocket, and let's get out here and use our brains to think. If you can't think, okay, then stay in your religion. Stay in your box. And as I always said, okay, we are the last people that should be fighting among ourselves, whether we're Hebrew, Christians, or Muslims. Because without the spiritual stories of the Nile Valley, none of those religions would exist in the first place. And then we use it as a football team, and then we try to distort history with it as though their religions go back to the beginning of time and distort history and everything else with it. Because we become fanatical, just like the Europeans who use their religions for conquest and enslavement of other people around the world.
Right.
And that mystery system is called the Shashata system. That was the spiritual system based off of the spiritual dialectical laws of opposites based off of Ma'at that I talked about earlier. That's the spiritual system that the whole universe is governed by. And there's nothing pagan and heathen about spiritual dialectical laws of opposites which the whole universe is balanced by. Even though they're trying to corrupt that and create isfit forces, as our ancestors saying, okay, and throwing a whole lot of other stuff out here, destroying that whole, as they have done. They have had no respect for nothing. And have used their religion to spiritually enslave other people as well as African people.
800-450-7876. Let's go to Malik in Palm Springs. Malik, you're on with Brother Kwesi.
Hey, Brother Kwesi. How you doing, Carl? Just want to thank y'all for taking the call. I just want to say, I got one of your DVDs. I'm 45 now. I got one of the DVDs probably when I was 20. And I just want to thank you for opening my eyes to the truth. And it wasn't that you showed me. It was more that you said, if you don't believe me, go do your own research. So I did. And I found out that, like you said, everything that we think we know here in the States is based off of Kemetic knowledge. And
hang on a second, Malik, because we're going to take a break. I'll let you finish up on the other side.
Okay.
800-450-7876 to speak to Brother Kwesi. Take your calls in about 2.5 minutes.
1450 WOL. This.
And thank you for staying with us and our guest, the master teacher, Ashra Kwesi, in the class of Dr. Clark and Dr. Ben. Those of you who never had a chance to hear Dr. Clark or Dr. Ben, you got to listen to master teacher Ashra Kwesi and also Renoka Rashidi. Whenever you hear these fellas are in your neck of the woods, check them out, because this is where the real learning is. Let's go back to Malik in Palm Springs, California. Malik, I'll let you finish up your question or comment for Brother Kwesi.
Okay, yeah, I just wanted to, thank him personally for all the great things he's done for our people. By waking me up, he's woken up a lot more people, and it's just spreading. And I just want to say, if people don't think that the relationship between Egypt and the United States and the rest of the world is really real, look at the back of that dollar bill. You see the pyramid, and you see the eagle. One European, one African. So there's a large relationship going on there. If you only open up your eyes, open up your mind, and really understand that this is a bigger game than you think you are in. And it is time for us to wake up. We're getting closer to certain planets that we haven't been to in a long time. So, everything in its own time, sure. But I just want to thank you, Dr. Kwesi. And you are a jewel and the greatest breed of our time at this time. So thank you very much.
All right, thanks for
Thank you very much, brother. And yes, you're absolutely right. I mean, I even have a lecture on the African origin of Western Freemasonry. Of course, if one is going to lock down in their mind that this is the devil and this is Lucifer, I mean, this is the kind of crap that they lock some black folks' mind down through fear, of studying and research. And even though they've incorporated all these symbolism and everything into their systems and so forth, while they have secretly benefited, from what they've stolen out of the African continent. So again, this is a sad thing, whereas, we're taught and locked into belief and everything else, and we see their whole world is, they're living in luxuries and everything else that they have benefited from, built institutions, massive institutions, for white supremacy, Christianity and white supremacy civilization, and again, all we have to do is just start to open our minds up. This is part of the enslaved system. Again, not to believe it, but to start to have critical analytical analysis. After all, that's what even education should be for. If you can't have a critical thinking in your education, then of course you're not truly being educated. You're just being trained. And most of us, in a lot of cases, that's the case. We're like, trained animals in some cases.
Right, and it's sad, and that is so sad, Brother Kwesi. A lot of us want somebody to tell us what to believe, what to think, how to think, and we're so used to it that we just do it automatically. But you tell them something and say, "Hey, check it out for yourself." Just
right.
Like the last caller from Palm Springs.
I'm not coming on here with somebody to believe this. Just look around. As I said, I've talked about many things on here today. Look at the architecture. Africa speaks to us all the time. Stop dealing with the hatred of Africa. Stop dealing with the negativity to keep us away from it. These are things that cause us to neutralize, And, again, if you want to deal with something pagan, then start to study the pagan symbolism that we see that's going on right now with Easter Bunny and everything. So if you want to talk about paganism and everything else and devil worship, then deal with Satanilia, the Santa Claus and all of that. Start to deal with that, and just research that. You'll be shocked what you come up with.
That's all you got to do, folks. Again, I mentioned it's Emancipation Day in Washington, D.C., so you got to emancipate your mind. 800-450-7876. Speak to Brother Kwesi. Brother Kwesi, how can folks get more information for what you do, the books that you have, the trips that you take?
Yes, sir. Thank you, Brother Carl. Well, you can go to kemetnew.com. That's our website. That's spelled KEMETNU.com. And there on the website, we have our DVDs on there. We have our book, The African Builder, so you can see historical information, the personalities, the background on them. And on DVDs on many different subjects related around what I'm talking about. These are all studio produced. In many cases, I'm in Africa. In fact, our newest DVD is The Temple of Amen, The Origin of Religion and God's House on Earth, and Mary Roz, the African Goddess, the Spiritual Foundation of Ancient Kemet, and the topic that I'm dealing with today, the African origin of Christianity. Okay, where I'm dealing right there. I'm dealing with Ethiopia. I'm dealing with Egypt and showing, and you know, without question where these things are coming from. Brother Carl. And then, of course, if you want to see some live footage, you can go and push the button, you know, and see Egypt videos. And I'm right there live, right there in some of the temples and tombs, okay, again, for us to see the information and show the comparative analysis where many of these things were taken and incorporated into the Western version of Christianity.
And the next trip?
Our next trip will be in July. That'll be July 12th to the 26th. That's 15 days. We go annually every year. Went last year. We were in Tahrir Square. Didn't see one person. Okay. And people ask about going to Egypt, but they don't talk about going to Jerusalem. Okay. Where they are told Jesus walked on the red rug that hasn't been worn in 2,000 years, even though the Palestinians and Jews are shooting bombs at each other. So, no, there are no problems whatsoever traveling in Egypt. They had protests there during the summer, and the United States, okay, would not give us a visa to go to Egypt if they felt there was a problem, okay? But again, just like you have situations in Boston and situations in Detroit, and in fact, when I was in England lecturing, and some people even said they didn't want to come to the United States because if they come there, they might get shot, okay? If they come to the United States because of all the gun violence that takes place in the United States. So again, there's no problem traveling. We do the historical places in the Nile Valley, and we do our Ethiopia trip annually every winter. That's December the 28th. This year will be December the 28th to January 8th. And if you're a Christian, here's a place to go where you can see the ancient churches. Okay, churches that that predate European churches. Okay, the churches, Lalibela, this breathtaking, where they carved deep down into the earth, 40 feet down. But of course, the Europeans said Africans in Ethiopia had nothing to do with that. Ethiopians did not build that the Knights Templars came and built those churches. Black people had nothing to do with that, all right? See, again, so to neutralize Africa in any way, to take it out of Africa. How about Deborah Damu? You have to be really born again to go to church here, climbing up these ropes or fall again. So here we see, again, the system, okay? When you see the early Gnostics fled into Ethiopia, let's look at Madawe, where you see that the Meroitic culture of the ancient Nubians, okay, equally, who were Christians practicing with the Gnostics taught. That's why they were fleeing, because the Romans were trying to kill them all. Because the Romans were corrupting the spiritual stories that were told by black people thousands of years, that goes back thousands of years. And that's the spiritual idea of the Charis, or the Christ, and the baptism. No, I'm not talking about the baptism that somebody had to put their hands on you. I'm talking about the baptism that took place in the amniotic fluid of your mother's womb. That was the first baptism until the Western Church in 418 corrupted it because of misogyny, and then seeing that your mother breaks her water, you come forward. The hatred of the woman is the fact that we can theorize on a whole lot of things, but we see male and female coming from her. So then that's when they said, the Western Church said, we'll baptize you in this water, taking the power away from her. The spiritual baptism takes place where we all came from, Carl, the amniotic fluid of our mother's womb. That's the original and spiritual foundation of the baptism until it was corrupted.
Brother Kwesi, Fahim is joining us from the ATL. Fahim, can you make it quick so he'll have a chance to respond?
Yeah, I want to start thank Dr. Kwesi for teaching us the truth. I know it's the most difficult thing that you could ever teach anyone. And, we're taught by science that we're energy beings, and energy can't be destroyed; it can only be transferred. But to believe this religion, we go to hell, we are burnt in fires and devils, we walking on water. It's all of these fairy tales, but they don't believe the truth. But they believe all of these fairy tales. It's just mind blowing, brother.
This is part of the brainwashing process that it takes place, okay? Again, as I said before, you go into a university, they'll go in there and they will not argue with a professor, a white professor, Okay, when they're teaching science, they will not come up there and say, my religion does not teach that, and that's not right when you're talking about science. And no, they're not going to say that, okay, to get out of that school. Again, the reason what we see in science today was taught thousands of years ago by our ancestors. The Western world went down when they destroyed the spiritual system. The Greeks took it. And then when the Western church came into being with Theodosius and Justinian, this is when they shut down Egypt. They shut down the temples. Okay, they burned papyruses. Okay, they burned the Alexandria Library. This is what took Europe through the so-called Dark Ages. Okay, and it was the Arabs who opened it back up when they came in and got the Byzantine Romans out of Egypt, and they started to study the science. And it was not until the European scientists who started to rediscover the ancient spiritual systems of the Nile Valley, when Copernicus and Galileo and all these things were taught, and even some of them, like Newton, even said that we're getting this from ancient Egypt. As I said, Giordano Bruno, equally, when they burned him at the stake. And now to keep you away from knowledge and science, okay, of the truth, as you just said earlier, brother, they said they'll burn you at the stake, or the devil will burn you forever and ever. Then they burned you literally during the Inquisition. Now they neutralize and put fear. They got a terrorized devil to put in people's mind to stay away from knowledge through spookism. So it's through spookism that's killing us.
I see it as three-card Molly. You know, the three religions is like three-card Molly, but every card you turn over is a trick.
Right.
And you know, when I was young, brother, they had the Jews. When I was a child, the Jews were the chosen people, and in Christianity, Jesus was the Son of God. He wasn't as great as his Father. Now that I'm an adult, the Jews have moved back, and Jesus is God. He's taken over his Father's spot. So they changed these things right before our very eyes. We don't question. We just go along with this dance, brother.
Well, that's what spiritual enslavement is. I said, how the enemy becomes the deity, the spiritual subconscious of your mind. The sad thing with this new movie with a great big old picture of some white guy, another one that they found, and said, the Son of God. Okay, as I said, that was taken from the Medu Netra that I show our groups, where I put my hand 10 inches carved into the temple that means the Son of God. Here, that's the symbol where they corrupted it to this European image, which again, for people to see, to keep up the brainwashing. Okay,
right, so we got to go. Fahim, thanks you called, Brother Kwesi. We just out of time. But thank you again for all the words that you left us with today.
Thank you, Brother Carl. And again, all we want people to do, and thank you for your community, okay, for people to think. That's what it's for, to think, not to believe what we said here today.
All right, thanks, Brother Kwesi.